Good morning. What an honor it is to receive the Leo Mechelin Medal and to be a conversationist at this event this morning. Having been an emeritus already for some years, speaking from this podium 9 o'clock in the morning is a rare event, but a very nostalgic one, I have to say. I did get up. Oh, thank you, Tuija, for the introduction. Thank you, the Leo Mechelin Foundation, for the medal and for the honor and the invitation to come here. My intention this morning is to talk about the crisis of liberal legalism, including the crisis that liberals find when they look around in the political societies in the West today. I am less interested in the crisis, so-called, regarding the attacks that liberals and advocates of the rule of law have been experiencing from the outside recently. I'm much more interested in the internal crisis of liberal legalism, to what extent the ways of liberal rule of law are experiencing its internal tensions and contradictions today, maybe more strongly than earlier on in this or the previous century. I take my starting point from a conversation I listened to on podcast while running there in Kruunuhaka a few days ago. Like a good priest, I start with a personal story. So I was listening to this podcast, I'm sure many of you do, from New York Times, Ezra Klein and his conversations with other Americans regarding the crisis, as they say, that exists in the American political system to which Chancellor Hameri referred to. In this specific conversation, Ezra Klein was meeting up with the black civil rights activist and author, literary person, and a polemist, Ta-Nehisi Coates. And it was obvious that the perspectives of Ezra Klein, a good left liberal, and Ta-Nehisi Coates, a civil rights activist, diverged utterly, to the extent that it seemed to me that Klein just did not understand what Coates was saying when they were addressing the present situation. In that conversation, Klein wanted to know why we lost, and he meant the presidential election. And Coates responded, well, sometimes one loses. Klein was puzzled and said, well, that sounds a little bit too deterministic to me. And Coates responded, it doesn't sound deterministic at all to him. And he took a deep breath and gave a little explanation. Look, Ezra, he said, I am Ta-Nehisi Coates. I'm a writer and an individual, right? But I'm part of something larger. And I have always felt myself part of something larger. I have a tradition, an ancestry, a heritage. I do what I do with the time that has been granted to me. And much of what I do is built on what others have done before me. And after that, I leave the struggle where I leave it. Hopefully in a better place, but oftentimes not. This is a historical fact. Klein just couldn't get it. Then Coates goes on to recount the struggles of his ancestors against slavery, against racial discrimination. Most of those ancestors, including his father, his grandparents, his grandparents, witnessed both little victories and terrible losses, ups and downs. Most of them never saw the outcomes of their struggles. This is what Coates had in mind when he thinks about the situation in terms of, well, sometimes we lose. This is where he sees himself. So I want to vindicate or look into some of the background of that clash between Coates and a liberal legalist, Ezra Klein, as I reconstruct him. The liberal response to what is understood as a crisis of the rule of law, of the welfare state, but above all of the rule of law, has been to press upon the very idea of the rule of law, to make people understand the importance of law and legal institutions, courts especially. From the perspective of Coates, this is a little short-sighted and would not get to the bottom of it. Rule of law, as Tuija Brax noted, relies on social conditions. And I am going to say a few words about those social conditions. In so doing, I rely on the impressive work of the French social thinker, philosopher, polemicist, Marcel Gauchet. Gauchet last year published the last installment of a massive five-volume work on l'avènement de la démocratie, the emergence of democracy, and analyzes the present moment indeed as a crisis, but a crisis that cannot be dealt with by law, a crisis in which law and liberal legal thinking cannot get to the bottom of it, the social conditions, namely. And according to him, and what I'm going to suggest to you, this crisis is a social crisis, and it has to do with the way liberal societies have structured the relationship and internal meaning of three notions, namely politics, history, and law. I would say Coates is in the same group as Leo Mechelin. The problems I'm going to point to are not problems at the time when Mechelin was traveling around in Europe advocating Finnish autonomy, eventually independence, and especially the idea of the rule of law as an important part of the new nation, its life and its public operations of its public realm. Politics, history, and law. In liberal thinking, each of these three realms has a certain tension, but those tensions are mediated by the relationship of the three realms in actual societies. Politics, in the liberal mind, is constituted by a tension between the group and the individual. And for Mechelin and for other early 20th, late 19th century liberal thinkers, that tension between the group and the individual is reconciled by democracy, parliamentarianism, the idea that parliament is constituted of the representatives of the nation, and that parliamentary legislation, laws, express the sovereignty of that nation. Very little, apart from the language, is left of thinking precisely in that way. Representativity, sovereignty. Instead, what we now speak and think is governance. Politics is about governance. I come to that. History, then. In the late 19th century, when Leo Mechelin was advocating rule of law and Finnish independence. He was clear that this had to do with history. It had to do with a tension between the past and the present. And in his time, and in early 20th century, liberal societies reconciled that tension through large ideas to which we gave the names of conservatism, agrarian nationalism, social democracy, maybe radicalism. But these ideas invite us, some of them, to look closely into the past, conservatism, and to learn the lesson. People in the conservative camp then debate with those in the more radical camp who look into the future. But each of them having the sense that what they are a part of is a nation. That although they are individuals and their life is limited, that the life of the nation is not limited. And that the very identity of that thing of which they think of themselves as representatives has a much, much longer history than they. And that their being part of that history is an important part of who they are and what they want to do. And thirdly, law. Law, which in the liberal mind tries to mediate the tension between public order and individual rights. When Mechelin was active, the idea was that these two ideas, public order and individual rights, would be reconciled in the form of the law. Legal formalism, late 19th century, classical legal thought. The law embedded in the forms of the law that come out from the legislative body and are vindicated by courts. Constitution, lifting some matters up from outside the political realm, acting autonomously towards the political society. How easy it is for us nowadays to defend that question. So I summarize. So until I suggest, following Marcel Gauchet, that sometime until the 1970s, and by the time the 1980s were over, we no longer could quite think about politics, history, and law in this classical liberal way, a way born in the 19th century, a way in which the nationhood, parliamentarianism, and the form of the law come together to form a whole that's larger than any individuals and to which we strive to be representatives of. What has happened to these three things then? Politics first. There are external problems. It's really hard for a liberal to justify nationhood in a globalized world. Seeing the groups of migrants and asylum seekers and saying, no, you can't come here, it's really hard for a liberal universalist to say, why am I entitled to hold on to my privileges and not allow those privileges to be shared by people who obviously would be much better off if they shared them? The idea of nationhood has become universal. That changes the nation. It ends the history in a sense. Everybody is a nation and everybody has a state. What is the state? The state is a governor of that nation in its daily activities. A governor of issues about the economy, about environment, about technology, etc. Everybody does that in their own little state. It's really hard for a liberal to accept that that's all there is. And moreover, those external threats and challenges, as we say, that liberal and other states are faced with and their governments are called upon to manage have to do with things that seem impossible to be governed through politics. What about security? We need experts in security. We need to talk to the military. We need to educate people to become security experts. What about the environment? Politics, no? Well, we need to have environmental experts to tell us what happens in the Baltic Sea. What about the climate change? What is the role for the nation? A politician committed or expected to commit to the nation. How helpful is that commitment in view of those and many other technical problems? So the governments that we have, it seems, are not so much governors of specific nations, but are managers of wholly global forms of expertise. The representative of the Environment Ministry, the representative of the Trade Ministry, the representative of the Interior Ministry, and indeed of the Ministry of Justice, manage forms of knowledge that nowadays have very little national about them. In every country, the same problems emerge. And these experts, they are networked in wholly global networks of ideas, of conversations. They are all once upon a time, or were once upon a time, Erasmus students, and came to know each other and constantly emailed to each other. Where is nationhood, politics? There are also internal problems. Parliamentary democracy. At Leo Mechelin's time, people were competing for the position of representatives of the nation. They wanted to portray themselves as people whom others could accept as working for something larger than a special interest of a group, working for a nation. Do we still see parliamentarians as representing something larger than their group, their constituency, their party, their interest group? What is it to represent a nation today? Hard to articulate in the political realm. Identity politics. Of course, it's a big part of the liberal idea. You must be able to develop an identity autonomously and to be able to defend that identity. Defend against whom? Well, other people, of course. But what is the nation? Other people. So liberal politics is entangled in both external and internal issues that seem, if not insoluble, at least pretty daunting. If you were Leo Mechelin and you looked at the situation. Then history. Past, present, and future. How do you put them in a meaningful continuity? If you have the idea of the nation, it's no problem. And many people describe that nation in various colorful ways, and sometimes, especially people like Leo Mechelin in the late 19th century, drew inspiration from that description, that historical description, that looked both to the past of the nation, the hard times of the forefathers, and then the bright future to come for all of us. Not maybe for me, because sometimes we win, sometimes we lose, but for them. Do we still think that way? Can we still think that way? How do you articulate that in politics of history? Now, governance, we now hear, is to a great extent the enabling or the facilitation of the civil society to work its own ways, or to be more specific, to allow the market to operate without disturbance. What other justification do states have than to see to there not being disturbances in the creation of value by the appropriate operation of the system of offer and demand? Now, value obviously is created through economics. Economics that then seems to have become the principal content of the politics of the nation. As we read media, as we listen to politicians. Economic governance, however, looks at the present. It's necessary to have austerity today. Or is it necessary? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I don't know. How does the nation relate to that? What is the future that we are looking for when we decide on austerity or support for or choosing an industrial policy? What are the lessons of the past? What is the image of the future? Value, as I said, is produced in the market on the basis of punctual exchanges here and now. And as the saying is, because liberals obviously know all of this, we know the price of everything but the value of nothing. And then go on repeating that. Law. Well, nowadays it has become hard to talk about politics in the term of the nation, or history in terms of these large scales of temporality. And so we reference law. Law, the rule of law, courts are what gets us out of this swamp into which we have fallen, the intellectual, the social swamp into which we have fallen. Can law do that? Well, in the 19th century, that was a time of legal formalism. I don't need to tell that for the lawyers present. So legal formalism has had a very specific German orientation. It situated the core of law in the will of the legislator. We abide by the law because it brings out the will of the legislator, and the legislator represents the nation. And the nation has a history. And the legislation brings us from the past to the future, containing, as it were, the ideal society in legal form. Already by the time of the late 19th century, at the turn of the century, this didn't seem to work. One of the best analysts of the matter was Max Weber. In his writings on late modern society, Weber noted that legal formalism no longer operates as it was supposed to. Why? Well, because it thinks in terms of rules applicable in the same way to everybody, irrespective of the situation. But late modern society, Weber said, is characterized by fragmentation, by diversity, by people living inside the same society in completely different conditions. And if you apply the same rules to people in different conditions, you get injustice. You can't do that. And so, in the early 20th century, law schools or law faculties, but also the very understanding of law changed from that very formalistic idea to a more functionally oriented, an instrumental idea of law. Law as the instrument of social purposes, as open-ended efforts to bring out the optimal solution, to realize equitable relationships, to mediate contract provisions in view of what is equitable in the particular relationship between the parties. The rise of labor law, of social laws, of laws that no longer treated people in the same way, but tried to take into account their specific position and looked for social justice, open-ended, abstract provisions. Now, when that happened, what happened at the same time, or by virtue of this, was that power, social power, was transposed from the legislator to the law applier, the person who is now invited by law to decide what is appropriate here, what is proportionate here, what is equitable here and there. And the management of a society in the early and mid-20th century that takes upon itself more and more tasks, the rise of the welfare state, The management of society becomes a complete set of administrative tasks by a sprawling group of administrative institutions, which started to seem problematic because it accepted and perpetuated, if you wish, the division of society into these huge number of groups, but on the other hand, also transferred powers to administrative agencies to decide by reference to what is appropriate for the situation, what is the cost-effective solution for this city when you decide on, let's say, permits for industrial impositions or housing. Sometime in the 1970s, people started to think, enough is enough, and that there must be some limit to this dilution of law into instrumental directives for administrative officials. And so they started to say things such as, you can't do that, even though it is optimal, socially speaking. For example, imagine the situation that if a law on housing in a city such as Helsinki would call upon the city officials always to decide on housing decisions on the basis of what's economically optimal, and a study is produced according to which the economically optimal thing is that people over 65 years would be housed somewhere outside the center, close to graveyards and hospitals. And economically active people were housed in the middle of the city. Now, surely you must be able in that situation to say, no, Dad and Mom must have a right to stay there. They've lived there all their lives in Kruunuhaka. And so what happens at this point is that people want to demand rights. And these rights are the new formalism, which says you can't just look at equity, at appropriateness, at proportionality. You must be able to give these people what they want because they have a right. A professor at Harvard produced a theory according to which, in the 1970s, Ronald Dawkins, according to which these rights that were mushrooming over societies presented themselves as trumps. Now, I realize that expression nowadays has an awkward connotation. A trump card, you know, the card with which you win when you play. That rights are trumps, that when you come to a political conversation and you produce the right, then that's it, you won. Because it cannot be overruled by these other administrative, welfare state-oriented political and instrumental calculations. Now, that's very useful to the extent that it goes, but who does have rights? How do you know rights? And of course, when social actors started to see that those other people were able to get their way because they were successful in their right claims, so maybe I can do that claim as well. And by the end of the 20th century, human rights activists started to worry that there are rights all over the place, this unlimited proliferation of rights. And the question emerges, well, how do you differentiate between a real right and a fake right? Now, there was once upon a time a way to do that. Natural rights existed in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, Hugo Grotius, and all that. But when liberals became modern, then a part of what they became was no longer that. They thought, yes, Hugo Grotius was an interesting historical figure, but we no longer think that rights descend from heaven, and we have some litmus test through which we can check whether some claimed thing is a fake right or a real right. And when rights proliferated, and every social actor was able to translate their interest into their right, then every social conflict was a rights conflict. And so when human rights activists and human rights lawyers and I started to read the expanding jurisprudence of human rights bodies, the European Court of Human Rights, also domestic courts, I found that that jurisprudence more often than not was about solving conflicts of rights, because both parties, in one way or another, were able to present their claim as a rights claim. And that required that the solver of that conflict had some standard higher than the right for them to be able to balance, as the saying goes, the rights against each other. So which is a good right, or how do you balance the right of freedom of speech of one to the right of privacy of another? Where is the standard? But more importantly, if you think that there is a standard, why do you read the rights in the first place? You can just apply the standard. But the whole thing about the rights started from our suspicion that the standards would be the standards of those people who apply the laws. And they were suspect. We needed the rights to be able to say, you can't overrule this by your ideas of good or proportionate or whatever. Anyway, so this is where we are with liberal law today. The seduction of rights, which also comes together, obviously, with the problems of history. So the more we think of the work that we do in terms of the rights that we realize, the more we slide into identity politics. And the less possible it starts to seem to think about a legislation where a nation is represented, where no individual acts but just people who represent something larger. No, everybody is just enclosed in their identity, including the representatives of us. How do you deal with where is the historical continuity? What do we learn from the past to the present? So I suggest there is a social crisis that has to do with our inability, or the inability of liberals. I slide too easily from our to liberals, but that usually works well, at least in the contexts of this house. So where do we go? What can we do? Well, one thing we have to take count of is the backlash against all of this. There are groups of people who have somehow realized that this message that the liberals have been bringing forward for such a long time seems to be stumbling in its own cleverness at so many places. And so maybe you can say that somebody you are politically against is just an utterly unacceptable alien who should be refused to take part in this nation, because I have an idea of a nation. So perhaps hate speech is free speech. How do you make the distinction? Where is the criterion of difference? If it's true that politics is about identity, if it's true that history is only what we decide between quarreling identities in the marketplace of ideas here and now, if that's where value comes from, you have nothing to say to the one who defends hate speech as freedom of speech. So there is this backlash. Obviously, the backlash uses these liberal languages because they are there, easy to use and turn to whatever purpose, because those languages are no longer embedded in a social structure where meaning is created through the relationship of politics, history, and to which law relates in some definite way. Of course, and the attack is against experts, the liberal experts. The attack is against globalization and the liberal hypocrisies, because that's what they look like. Hypocrisies obviously, taking control of the narrative. But of course, none of this is real. This, the irrationalism, the nihilism that the call for taking back an idea of nationhood, it's not real. But it's real in the sense that it is our society. Some years ago, another French philosopher, Didier Eribon, published a book, an autobiographical work with the title Returning to Reims, a city in the countryside of France. And he had left Reims because he quarreled with his dad. His family in Reims, they had been workers in the shipyards, and they were communists, but the generation gap between the parents of Didier and Didier himself was too great. And so he just banged the door and left to Paris and became a reasonably famous public intellectual in France in 25 years. And then his father died, and he returned to Reims. And he witnessed, and together with his mother, they went through old photographs. And those photographs showed his father, with whom he could not get along. His father in social contexts of workers' strikes and of the meetings of the workers' unions. And there were black Africans workers, there were Turkish workers, they were all having a conversation together. They were all communists. And he was looking at those pictures and he realized, oh, I didn't understand it at the time. That you could be together, you could have a program, you could have a project. Didn't matter if you had been born in Ghana or in Istanbul. It didn't matter. You were together because in some ways you shared something that I would now say Ta-Nehisi Coates also referenced in this conversation with Ezra Klein. And now he's there in Reims, and his mother, and everybody votes for Marine Le Pen. What happened between the time when he left Reims and now? So what is to be done? Obviously, Ta-Nehisi Coates has no problem understanding what has to be done. The same thing as the previous generation, and we can learn from them, their little victories and their big defeats. We can learn from them. And we are not going to conquer, but it's not the point. I think Mechelin would have been fine with that. And he was part of a project that has a history, that was embedded in a historical idea of that very project of Finland. An idea that was being created and started to flourish precisely at the time when he was working, and with a factor that he was not only very knowledgeable of, but of which he was a part of. So, how do you do this? I don't think law can substitute for the project that is ahead. So in that sense, I don't think constitutionalism, a constitutional court, procedures, rule of law are helpful. It's a social project. One of the things that it has in it is confidence, a project of confidence. That sounds really utopian and strange, doesn't it? How can, in a world of nihilists, how can confidence be created? But it's not a world of nihilists only. All of us relies on confidence. We rely, for instance, that the doctor who treats us is competent. We choose an experienced architect to design our house, and we want our grocer to be honest in charging us and removing the rotten fruit from the shelves. We rely constantly on confidence without thinking much about it. Can that be the beginning of a political society? I don't know. I recently listened to a conversation on referenda. And especially, there were many people, these were lawyers and political scientists, and many of them were very critical of referenda and plebiscites, especially in the toxic atmosphere of the present. And I think many of us understand the reasons. But in that conversations, something came up. Switzerland. So Switzerland obviously has referenda all the time. How do the Swiss prepare for the referenda? Well, the Swiss government produces an explanation of the positions and only that governmental paper or report is produced as part of the campaign. And some people in the conversation say, no, that's not possible. I mean, government is a part of this. But then what I learned was that none of the experts, Swiss experts on referenda, has ever suggested that there would be any general suspicion about the government's explanation of the stakes of the referendum. In New Zealand, it's the same thing. But there's another law in New Zealand according to which the government's information campaign must be, have 10 times the amount of resources, money, than any single proponent. And that's not contested in New Zealand. The government's program has 10 times as much resources to explain the stakes to the people. Why do the people believe that that is not just a partisan pamphlet? I don't know. But I think it's interesting. So the liberal political imagination pits groups against individuals, past against present, order against freedom. It sets these out not as problems to resolve, but as an existential frame within which we should think of our social lives. But it has nothing to offer as to how we mediate those tensions. It's left tangling, oscillating wildly, arbitrarily between the poles. Sometimes it's only a group, sometimes it's only an individual. Sometimes everything is in the past, sometimes there's only the future. The anthropologist Elisabeth Povinelli, in her recent work, has analyzed the feeling in the late liberals. She calls them toxic liberals, but I want to avoid that expression. Late liberals, that the end is near, or that we are already in the end. That vocabulary is everywhere. Liberalism sees the death of everything. The death of the welfare state, the death of the rule of law, the death of democracy, the death of, I mean, you name it, the death of everything. So, but the liberals are the only ones who see that end. That's because the liberals are the only group of people who believe in justice to be produced here and now through procedures. Justice by laws, procedures, and agreement. They are the only people who believe that. And disappointed utopians are on their way to becoming cynics. Resignation in force of the inevitability of all of that. And maybe especially climate change and the acceptance of the overshoot. Now, in the conversation between Klein and Coates and in the studies of Elisabeth Povinelli, matters are different in the global south. There, crisis is a permanent condition. It's not the end of anything. It's where we always live. It marks our past, our present, and apparently our future too. So unlike the neoliberal north in crisis, history is present in the scars of the global south that it can feel every day and that it suspects will be the scars they will carry into the future. Victories and losses, nothing more than that. Well, I should come to the end of this. Both Gaucher and Povinelli believe that climate change is going to change this. that this will compel everybody, including the liberals, to rethink. And that once the wave, in physical terms as well as in metaphoric terms, once the wave crushes everything that now exists, all the imagination, all the technologies, and we see the strand again, then something different can maybe be imagined. In the predicament, in this new predicament, the post-climate change predicament, that's very soon to be here, the nation no longer can be the carrier of the imagination of politics, of history, especially the future. And it cannot mark Finland's, whatever remains, relationship to the world. Now the new task is to mediate again and to find a way in a predicament. But the predicament is different. It is that between humanity and nature. And here the liberal experience can no longer pretend to be universal. Thank you very much.